In today's episode, we're diving into the dumbest animal attacks ever caught on record. From tourists who ignored every warning sign to campers who thought wild animals were just big pets, these ridiculous decisions led to some seriously painful consequences. Let's begin with the first story. It was December 2nd, 2017 in the village of Abovtrud, located in the Istra district 25 miles west of Moscow. The air was cold, the ground damp from the early morning fog that clung to the barren trees. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, but no one in the village paid it much mind. Life moved slowly in Abovtrud. The people here were used to the quiet, used to the isolation that came with living at the edge of civilization, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a place where secrets were easily kept, and conversations often took place behind closed doors. Sergei Alexandrovsky, a man with a fortune made in the airline industry, lived in the heart of this village. At the time of the incident, Sergei was the CEO of Rosia Airlines, a company he had built from the ground up. But beyond his business dealings, Sergei had another passion: animals. In the early 2000s, he had built a private zoo at his home, a menagerie of exotic creatures that was open to select visitors. It wasn't a grand zoo by any means, but more of a collection of animals housed in small enclosures, their cages barely large enough for the creatures inside. A lion, a tiger, and a black panther were among the most notable residents. The zoo had become something of a local curiosity, although most villagers had grown accustomed to the sounds of the animals. The distant roar of the lion, the unsettling grunting of the tiger pacing back and forth. While it wasn't officially marketed, the zoo was open to those who knew Sergei personally or could gain access through word of mouth. It wasn't until 2020, when the government passed a law banning the private ownership of exotic animals, that the zoo came under any real scrutiny. But by then, the animals, including the panther named Milan, were protected under the law's grandfather clause, and no one paid it much attention. On December 2nd, a group of 3 men from Ukraine found themselves in Abovtrud, visiting a nearby acquaintance. They had been drinking heavily, reliving old memories and telling stories of their youth. The alcohol had flowed freely, leaving them with a sense of invincibility. Their visit to the zoo had not been planned, but the alcohol prompted them to venture to Sergei's zoo. They had heard about the zoo during their stay, and with their judgment clouded by the alcohol, they thought it would be a fun idea to visit. It was late afternoon when they arrived at the cage of Milan, the black panther. The animal lay lazily on a wooden perch, its glossy black coat almost blending into the shadows. Milan didn't seem interested in them, its eyes unblinking as they stared back. The men, drunk and emboldened by alcohol, began to joke about feeding the panther. One of them, in a mix of alcohol-fueled confidence and foolishness, claimed he could do it. The others laughed, egging him on. A dare was a dare, after all. They hadn't considered the consequences, nor did they care. The panther remained still, watching them with an almost indifferent gaze. The man, spurred by the challenge, walked closer to the cage, but the narrow bars kept him from reaching the animal. The lock on the gate was secure, but that didn't deter him. The alcohol had dulled his judgment, and he felt an inexplicable surge of bravado. He had been watching the panther. Its placid demeanor lulled him into a false sense of safety. He didn't think it would react. His fingers fumbled with the lock. A few seconds passed, and with a soft clink, the lock broke. The gate creaked open. At that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Milan's indifference turned into focus. The panther's body tensed, its gaze now sharp and predatory. The man, in his drunken arrogance, stepped closer. Before he could react, the panther lunged. The leap was swift, a blur of black fur and powerful muscle. The man's body crashed to the stone floor, Milan's weight pressing down on him. The air filled with the sound of the man's scream, but it was cut short as the panther sank its teeth into his throat. Blood spurted from the wound, a pool quickly forming beneath them. The man's body went still, his final breaths shallow and ragged. The other two men stood frozen, staring in horror. Their first instinct was to flee. Whether they were hoping to find help or simply running for their lives, it didn't matter. They left their friend behind, abandoning him to the cold stone floor, his body slowly growing still. The panther, having satisfied its initial bloodlust, stood up, stepping over the man's body. It sniffed the air, its instincts guiding it. The gate had been left ajar. The panther moved carefully, stepping out into the open air. It hesitated for a moment, uncertain of its surroundings, but then, with a graceful movement, it slipped past the gate and into the wild, its steps silent but deliberate. Hours passed before anyone discovered the incident. The authorities were alerted and Sergei Alexandrovsky arrived at the scene. He had been informed by a local, perhaps the one who found the body or heard the screams. Sergei's arrival was swift, but his reaction was oddly detached. He claimed the man had been drunk, someone who had wandered into the enclosure on a dare. Sergei denied knowing the man, although it was assumed by many that the man's identity was known to him. The details of the attack remained unclear, but the focus soon shifted to the panther that had escaped. The authorities, meanwhile, kept the situation quiet. They made no public warning and took a more private approach to handling the panther's escape. They did not inform the villagers of the danger lurking nearby, perhaps fearing panic or unwanted attention. As the hours passed, some villagers began to worry about the possibility of the panther being nearby. Children had been playing outside, unaware of the danger. People had been walking their dogs, oblivious to the fact that a predator had slipped past the gate. It wasn't until much later that the panther was found, hidden beneath a thicket of brush, its eyes wary and alert, its muscles tensed as it adapted to the unfamiliar terrain. The authorities managed to recapture it, but it had been hours since the attack. During that time, it could have been anywhere. Sergei, ever the protector of his animals, insisted that the panther should not be put down. The local reaction, however, was one of anger. The zoo, still open for business, became a symbol of fear and frustration in the community. Many felt that Sergei's failure to secure the animals properly had put their lives in danger. There were whispers of how, had Sergei himself been the victim instead of the Ukrainian man, perhaps the zoo would be shut down and the neighborhood would be free from fear. An investigative committee was assigned to the case, but no conclusions were ever made public. The name of the deceased man was never disclosed, and the report remained sealed. The authorities made no effort to uncover the full truth. What was known for certain, however, was that Milan had acted in self-defense. The panther had protected its territory, responding to the intrusion of an unfamiliar human. July 9, 2012 was an oppressively hot summer evening in Raleigh, North Carolina. The sky was tinged with the last traces of daylight, cicadas buzzing in the thick air as the sun dipped behind the trees. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, its streets lined with modest homes, each with neatly trimmed lawns and driveways filled with parked cars. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries, where the biggest disturbances were backyard barbecues or the occasional barking dog. At the end of a cul-de-sac, a single-story house sat nestled among the trees, its windows glowing faintly against the growing dusk. Inside, the Collins family was gathering for dinner, an evening ritual that had remained unchanged for years. The house had been in the family for decades, inherited by Barbara Collins after her parents passed away. At 54 years old, Barbara had lived alone for some time, her only constant companion being Toby, the chimpanzee she had raised since infancy. Her daughter, Rebecca Collins, 38, visited often. A school administrator and single mother, she lived only 15 minutes away and made it a habit to check on her mother regularly. She had never fully approved of Toby, but had learned to tolerate his presence. He had been part of the family for over a decade, treated more like a child than an animal. Barbara had raised him as if he were human, dressing him in clothes, feeding him at the table, and speaking to him in a tone usually reserved for a young child. But as Toby grew, so did her unease. Rebecca's friend Matthew Carter, 41, was joining them for dinner that night. He had never met Toby before but had heard stories. He was polite but hesitant, well aware of the risks associated with keeping exotic animals in captivity. But Barbara had reassured them both. Toby was gentle, well-behaved, and no threat to anyone. Outside, the evening was settling into its usual calm, but inside the house, tension lingered beneath the surface. Toby had been restless all day, pacing near the windows, staring outside with an intensity that put Rebecca on edge. His behaviors had been changing in recent months, more unpredictable, more aggressive. He had begun reacting violently to loud noises, baring his teeth at unfamiliar visitors, and slamming his fist against the walls in frustration. Neighbors had already reported him escaping 3 times. He had once chased a dog down the street, another time throwing patio furniture into the road. Each time, animal control officers had warned Barbara of the risks. Each time, she had ignored them. Despite strict local regulations governing the housing of exotic animals, Barbara had managed to keep Toby as a pet by obtaining a special permit. The authorities required extensive safety measures, regular inspections, and proof of appropriate containment facilities for any primate kept in a private residence. Barbara argued that Toby was a well-socialized companion, a claim that allowed her to secure the necessary paperwork despite numerous warnings from wildlife experts about the unpredictable nature of such animals. Many critics, however, contended that the regulations were too lenient and failed to adequately address the inherent risks of keeping a chimpanzee as a pet. Yet, beneath the seemingly ordinary domestic scene, an unsettling undercurrent was growing, a silent indication that a disaster would soon shatter the fragile peace of their home. That night, as dinner was prepared and conversation filled the house, something inside Toby snapped. The meal had just been served when Toby became agitated. He had been pacing for most of the evening, his movements quick and restless, shoulders rising and falling with each breath. His gaze had remained locked on the windows, watching the street outside, his body language rigid and tense. His agitation was nothing new, but tonight there was an edge to it, something unsettled and unpredictable. Barbara had always dismissed his erratic behavior as moods that would pass, moments of frustration she believed she could control. But tonight, Toby wasn't listening to her commands. Rebecca noticed it first, the way he clenched and unclenched his hands, the subtle shifts in his posture. When Matthew sat down across from him, the chimpanzee's entire body stiffened, his lips pulling back slightly to expose his large canines. It was a warning, the kind of signal that would have sent any trained handler on high alert. Barbara barely reacted. She had spent years convincing herself that Toby was not like other chimpanzees, that he was different, special, human in his own way. She had ignored the warnings, the expert advice, the fines from animal control. She had convinced herself that love and routine were enough to suppress the instincts that had been ingrained in Toby since birth. The moment came suddenly. 1 second Toby was still, his dark eyes locked onto Matthew. The next he was moving. His powerful body launched forward with unnatural speed, closing the distance in an instant. The force of the impact knocked Matthew's chair backwards, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The sound of breaking glass followed as a dish crashed from the table, but it was drowned out by the guttural shrieks coming from Toby as he clamped his jaws onto Matthew's face. The first bite was devastating. Canines strong enough to puncture bone tore into Matthew's jaw, peeling away skin and muscle. The weight of the chimpanzee held him down, fingers digging into his shoulders with inhuman strength. Rebecca screamed as she rushed forward, grabbing at Toby's arm in a desperate attempt to pull him away. The chimpanzee released Matthew only to lash out at her, swinging with an open hand. The blow connected with her wrist, the sharp crack of breaking bone filling the room as she collapsed against the counter. Barbara shouted for Toby to stop, her voice shaking, but the command was meaningless. The chimpanzee wasn't responding to the person who had raised him, the woman who had treated him like her own child. He was lost in pure instinct, his mind locked in a primal fury that no amount of human attachment could undo. Matthew was still struggling beneath him, his hands pushing weakly at Toby's chest, but the attack was relentless. The chimpanzee's fingers curled around his arm, pulling it back at an unnatural angle before biting down again, crushing through the bone. Blood soaked the tile floor as Toby ripped away a piece of flesh, shaking his head violently. Rebecca, disoriented from the pain in her wrist, pushed herself up with her uninjured arm and stumbled toward the back door, breaking its glass as she hit it. Her only thought was escape. She barely registered the glass that cut into her bare feet as she threw open the door and ran. She sprinted across the yard, ignoring the searing pain in her wrist, pounding on a neighbor's door, screaming for help and calling the police in a desperate bid to summon assistance before the situation spiraled further out of control. Inside the house, Matthew's movements had slowed. The chimpanzee was still attacking, his teeth sinking into exposed flesh, his hands grasping at anything they could tear apart. The shrieks of rage had become slower, deeper. Toby's breath was rapid, his chest heaving. The damage had already been done. The first police officers arrived within minutes, responding to the frantic 911 calls. As they pulled into the driveway, the house appeared still, the front door slightly ajar but giving no immediate sign of the chaos inside. The neighborhood was quiet, the surrounding homes undisturbed. There were no screams, no visible struggle, only the eerie silence of a scene already set. Guns drawn, they stepped cautiously inside. Toby was still in the center of the kitchen, his body hunched over Matthew's lifeless form. His mouth and hands were red, his breath coming in sharp, fast bursts. The moment he saw the officers, he moved. The first shot struck center mass, but it did nothing to stop him. The second shot sent him staggering. It wasn't until the third round that Toby finally collapsed, his body twitching before going still. Paramedics entered moments later, but there was nothing they could do for Matthew. His body was barely recognizable. Rebecca was rushed to the hospital with multiple fractures and deep lacerations to her arm. Barbara, physically unscathed, sat frozen in the corner of the room, staring at the body of the animal she had once considered family. Investigators later reviewed the reports that had been filed against Barbara over the years. There had been repeated warnings from wildlife experts, citations for improper containment, recommendations that Toby be placed in a sanctuary where he could be managed safely. Each one had been ignored. Chimpanzees, particularly males raised in isolation, often developed unpredictable aggression as they aged. Their strength was unmatched in close combat, their bite capable of inflicting catastrophic injuries in seconds. Everything about the attack had been preventable. Barbara faced multiple lawsuits, including a wrongful death claim from Matthew's family. Her relatives and close friends were equally outraged and heartbroken over her decision to keep the chimpanzee, a choice they viewed as not only irresponsible but tragically avoidable. They expressed deep sadness, anger, and disbelief at how she could disregard repeated warnings and risk the safety of everyone around her. The incident prompted North Carolina lawmakers to review regulations on exotic animal ownership, leading to stricter laws regarding private ownership of primates. But it was too late to undo what had happened. April 11, 2022 was humid and gray off the southern coast of Bali. The tide was steady, the surf gentle, and visibility already dropping as morning rain clouds built along the horizon. Most locals stayed out of the water on days like that, especially near the deeper reef shelves where currents shift and predators roam. But to 30-year-old Derek Wincombe, it was perfect. He'd flown in from California the week before, chasing adventure on a 6-month break from his job in web development. Friends back home followed his every move online. Clips of him freediving in cenotes, balancing on narrow ridge trails, grilling seafood on remote beaches. The next post was supposed to be his best yet, filmed alone in murky water, surrounded by bait. Derek was the kind of person who craved intensity. He wasn't reckless in the way people usually meant. He researched gear, read travel advisories, and talked to locals. But once he felt confident, he didn't hesitate. He thrived on doing what others wouldn't, hiking into active volcano zones, spearfishing without a partner, diving into dark water for the rush of it. Friends called him bold. His parents called him stubborn. Derek called it living. The waters off southern Bali are beautiful but dangerous in ways that don't always show on the surface. Beneath the bright shallows lie drop-offs that plunge hundreds of feet, where tiger sharks, oceanic whitetips, and other predators roam. Rainfall brings silt and runoff from inland, reducing visibility to just a few feet. And when tourists chum the water, cutting baitfish to lure in bigger species for photos or sport, it blurs the line between curiosity and risk. Locals knew better. Derek didn't listen. Derek rented gear from a local dive shack and set out alone just after 9 a.m., a short scooter ride from his guest house. Locals who saw him off didn't say much, just exchanged looks. Most fishermen avoided solo spearfishing runs, especially in murky conditions. It wasn't just the reduced visibility, it was what reduced visibility attracted. Derek, however, was undeterred. He strapped on his GoPro, secured his spear gun, and paddled out with a mesh bag of chopped baitfish dangling from his hip, chum he planned to use to draw in action for the camera. The reef drop-off where Derek chose to dive was known for tiger sharks and oceanic whitetips. These aren't the slow gliding shadows seen from boats, they're bold, curious apex predators, drawn in by movement, scent, and the vibrations of a wounded fish. Oceanic whitetips in particular have a history of aggressive behavior toward isolated swimmers, especially when bait is in the water. They hunt high in the water column and are known to circle, bump, and strike. Tiger sharks, sometimes called the garbage cans of the sea, are even less discriminating. At over 14 feet long, they can deliver over 1,300 pounds of bite force and often mistake thrashing limbs for prey. In the open ocean, alone and chumming, Derek was mimicking the very things those sharks were designed to find. Derek Wincombe entered the water alone, spear gun in hand, off a remote reef shelf south of Bali. He'd ignored local warnings, skipped hiring a guide, and dragged a pouch of cut bait behind him for dramatic underwater footage. At first, things seemed quiet. Fish darted past, the water glowed green in the filtered light, but visibility dropped fast. As he descended, shadows began to flicker. A tiger shark appeared first, circling slowly. Then another form moved below, smaller, quicker. Derek steadied his grip. The first hit came without warning, a shoulder check that knocked the spear gun loose. Then the real strike followed. Jaws clamped onto his leg, dragging him into a spiral of blood and sand. He kicked, thrashed, tried to reach for the surface, but the current and weight of the animal overpowered him completely. When he failed to return, a search party found only torn wetsuit scraps and a broken spear gun floating near the reef. Derek's body was never recovered. No footage survived, no witnesses saw what happened. Just a series of poor choices in the wrong place. Diving alone, chumming the water, ignoring every warning. And an ocean that doesn't give second chances. When Derek failed to check out of his guest house, the host alerted a local dive shack who confirmed he'd gone out alone that morning and hadn't returned. A small search launched at dawn turned up only his broken spear gun, a torn piece of wetsuit, and his GoPro. Experts reviewing the footage concluded a large shark, likely a tiger or oceanic whitetip, had struck fast and fatally. With no flotation, no dive partner, and no backup, Derek never had a chance. Local fishermen, though saddened, weren't surprised. Shark activity in that reef was common, especially during the rainy season when runoff clouded the water and baitfish gathered. Warning signs were posted, and guides regularly cautioned against solo spearfishing or chumming. Derek's family flew in to collect his belongings, but no remains were ever found. Back in California, friends held a beach memorial, placing flowers beside a screenshot from his last trip. Derek had been bold, curious, and thrill-seeking, but he'd ignored every rule, diving alone, baiting predators, entering murky waters without support. They weren't the kind of mistakes experienced divers make, just the kind you don't get to make twice. July 17, 2019 was a blistering summer day on the Gulf Coast of Florida. The air was thick with salt and humidity, the afternoon sun beating down relentlessly on the white sand. Waves rolled lazily onto the shore, their rhythm steady and unbroken. The beach stretched for miles undisturbed, yet something was missing. There were no families lounging under umbrellas, no swimmers wading into the shallows, no footprints trailing toward the water. The only indications of recent activity were the brightly colored, freshly painted warning signs along the dunes, indicating the beach was closed because of sharks in the waters. They flapped in the breeze unnoticed by anyone, except for the 5 people standing just beyond them. At the edge of the dunes, a tight-knit group of local teens, raised in a small beach town where life revolved around the rhythm of the Gulf, hesitated as their footprints marked their first disturbance in the sand that day. They had grown up with the ocean as a constant companion, spending endless summers surfing, fishing, and swimming, their childhood memories steeped in sun, salt, and sand. Despite having read the bold warning signs and seen reports of 2 recent bull shark attacks that had barely spared their victims, the warm, inviting waters seemed less a deterrent and more a natural extension of their everyday lives. On this blistering July day, with vacation moods running high and a daring sense of familiarity with their coastal playground, they embraced the adventure, convinced that the risks were exaggerated. Among them was 19-year-old Daniel Reed, the first to step forward. He had always been the one to push boundaries, the one willing to take risks others wouldn't. He had grown up in water, his father owned a small fishing charter business, and Daniel had been swimming in the Gulf since he was a child. He spent his mornings surfing and could free dive to depths most people wouldn't dare. He had tangled with stingrays, dodged barracudas, and swam alongside nurse sharks on multiple occasions. The ocean had always felt like home, a place where he was untouchable. Even now, with the warnings posted in bold red letters, he was unfazed. The others hesitated because of the warning signs for sharks, but Daniel had already stripped off his shirt and stepped into the surf, the water curling around his ankles before rushing up his legs. He grinned over his shoulder and called back to them, daring them to follow. That was all it took. One by one, they followed. The ocean was as warm as bathwater, its surface smooth except for the occasional ripple of a passing wave. The first sandbar was shallow, the water barely reaching their waists. But beyond it, the seafloor sloped down into deeper waters where the Gulf stretched out in an endless expanse of blue. They floated, laughing, their voices carried by the breeze. The beach behind them shrank, the world beyond the water fading into a distant blur. They never saw the shadow moving beneath them. For the past few days, a bull shark had been prowling the coastline, drawn by the dense schools of baitfish swarming in the warm summer currents. At nearly 9 feet long and weighing over 300 pounds, it was the ultimate predator, powerful, territorial, and ruthlessly aggressive. Unlike great whites, which often bite and retreat, bull sharks attack with relentless force. Once they strike, they commit, locking onto their prey, thrashing violently, and tearing flesh apart with bone-crushing jaws. There is no hesitation, no second chance. Daniel was the farthest from shore, treading water approximately 150 feet out as he wiped salt from his eyes. The sun caught the waves glinting off the surface and momentarily blinding him. The others were still close, floating a few yards closer to shore, unaware of the presence circling below them. Then, in an instant, the water erupted. The impact was sudden and violent. A massive force struck Daniel from beneath, lifting him briefly out of the water before pulling him under. For a second, the ocean was still, the surface unbroken except for the widening cloud of red. Then a scream. Daniel surfaced, his body thrashing, his arms flailing wildly. The water around him was thick with blood, his face twisted in agony as he tried to keep himself above the waves. The shark had latched onto his right thigh, its jaws crushing down with over 1,300 pounds of force. Teeth as sharp as serrated blades had torn through muscle, severing arteries, nearly splitting the limb in two. He kicked instinctively, trying to break free, but the shark didn't release him. Instead, it began to shake. The violent thrashing sent fresh waves of blood surging into the water, clouding everything in deep red. Daniel's body jerked violently with each motion, his screams echoing across the open water before being cut short as he was yanked under again. His friends froze, unable to process what was happening. One of them started forward, his instincts telling him to help, but another grabbed him, holding him back. Then the water broke again. Daniel resurfaced, but now the shark had moved higher, its powerful jaws clamping down just below his ribs. His hands clawed at the air, his mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. The force of the bite crushed bone, tore flesh apart, and sent another rush of blood spilling into the waves. The others finally moved, panic setting in as they turned, swimming as fast as their bodies would allow, their arms and legs burning with exertion. The terror was all-consuming. On the shore, a couple had been walking along the dunes when they saw the group enter the water. They had watched, uneasy, knowing the beach was closed. When they heard the scream, they ran toward the water. The man pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, his voice frantic as he tried to explain what he was seeing. His wife stood motionless, one hand over her mouth, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Out in the water, Daniel's body twitched weakly, his movements slowing. The shark wasn't letting go. Each shake of its head sent another rush of blood spilling into the gulf, its jaws tearing deeper into his torso. Then, with one final wrenching motion, it dragged him beneath the surface. The others reached the shore moments later, collapsing onto the sand, gasping for breath. A few feet away, the couple stood frozen, the woman still covering her mouth, the man gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. A rescue boat was already launching from the pier, but it was too late. Search teams combed the area for hours, but there was no body to recover. The vastness of the Gulf and the nature of the attack left little hope of retrieval. By nightfall, the search was called off. Authorities reinforced the beach closures, posting new signs and increasing patrols. Marine biologists studied the waters, confirming multiple large sharks patrolling the area and advising that conditions made attacks more likely. In the days that followed, locals spoke of the attack in hushed tones, another reminder of the dangers that lurked beneath the waves. Friends and family of Daniel were stricken with grief and disbelief, their sorrow mingled with anger over what many called a reckless, dumb decision. Local news outlets and state officials in Florida condemned the incident, warning that such cavalier behavior in a known shark-infested area was not only tragic but entirely avoidable. A modest memorial, a simple wooden cross, was placed near the dunes where Daniel had entered the water, serving as a somber marker of the life lost. Yet, as always, the relentless ocean continued its unbroken rhythm, erasing the scars of that fateful day as if they had never been. Questions soon arose over whether enough warning signs had been posted and whose fault it truly was. While some argued that the beach's multiple clearly visible warnings should have deterred such reckless behavior, others maintained that the ultimate responsibility lay with those who chose to ignore them. As state officials and local residents debated the need for stricter enforcement and clearer communication, it became evident that this tragedy was a reminder of the need to respect nature's warnings before it's too late. August 19, 2018 was warm and windless along Australia's northern coast. The sun hung low over Byron Bay, casting long shadows across the empty shoreline where red warning flags flapped idly in the breeze. A lifeguard truck sat locked behind the gates of a closed beach access road, and beyond it, clear signage read, "Beach closed. Shark sightings reported. No swimming." The warning had been in place for days. issued after multiple drone patrols recorded a large great white patrolling just offshore. But late that afternoon, 5 teenagers ducked under the gate and made their way down the sand, laughing, filming, and ignoring everything they'd been told. 17-year-old Liam Norwick had planned the moment all week. He wasn't a thrill-seeker in the traditional sense. He didn't skydive or surf, but he lived for the kind of content that turned heads on social media. His friends called him the main character, partly in jest, partly because Liam leaned into it. At school, he was the one narrating lunchtime stories with perfect comedic timing. Online, he'd film fake stunts, reaction videos, and clips of himself getting chased by public security guards. He wanted attention, and that afternoon he had a plan to get footage of himself swimming past the closed zone buoys, throw in some muscle flexing and jokes, and maybe go viral for pushing the rules. The group set up their phones in the sand just beyond the flagged zone. Liam stripped off his shirt, grinned for the camera, and waded into the surf with exaggerated flexes and mock bravado. He shouted something about not being scared of fish before diving through a shallow wave and surfacing a few yards out. One phone zoomed in, another captured behind-the-scenes commentary. None of them noticed the ripple near the second buoy. A few moments later, the water behind Liam exploded in a violent splash. His scream was sharp and short-lived, loud enough to startle the group into silence. Then he vanished. What no one had seen just beneath the surface was the strike of a great white shark. These apex predators are ambush hunters capable of reaching over 15 feet in length and weighing upwards of 2,000 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 4,000 pounds per square inch, enough to sever limbs or split a seal in two. In murky coastal waters like those near Byron Bay, they hunt by silhouette, tracking prey from below and launching upward with devastating speed. Drone footage from earlier that week had confirmed one patrolling the area, and the beach had been closed for a reason. It was a known hunting corridor, made even more dangerous by the splash, motion, and noise of a lone swimmer breaking the surface. At first, Liam's friends thought he was playing. The camera kept rolling, but when he didn't resurface, his closest friend sprinted into the water, yelling his name. What he found was a cloud of blood spreading in slow spirals and a strip of fabric, part of Liam's board shorts floating on the surface. Panic broke out. One boy ran toward the access road to get a signal and call for help. Another collapsed on the beach, screaming into his hands. Phones were dropped, voices cracked, and the laughter that had filled the air just minutes before was gone. Paramedics arrived 30 minutes later, but there was nothing left to do. The boys had pulled Liam back toward shore, but he had already lost too much blood. His leg had been severed at the hip. The great white had bitten once and vanished. Textbook behavior for a large shark mistaking prey. The medical report later confirmed what responders already knew. Liam had bled out within minutes of the attack. The location matched drone footage from earlier that week, confirming the presence of the same shark that had triggered the original beach closure. Despite the warnings, despite the signs, he jumped in anyway. Video from the day circulated briefly before being taken down. It wasn't graphic, it showed Liam flexing, swimming, laughing. But it captured the lead-up so clearly that investigators used it to piece together the timeline. Interviews with the group revealed the pattern. They knew the beach was closed, they thought the warning was overblown, and they never imagined something could go so wrong so quickly. The attack reignited national debate about digital culture, teenage risk-taking, and the growing trend of dangerous stunts staged for social media clout. A memorial was held at Liam's high school gymnasium the following Friday. Hundreds attended. Students, teachers, local families. His parents didn't speak, but his younger brother read from a list of things Liam had planned to do. Study abroad, start a clothing brand, get a tattoo their mom wouldn't approve of. Friends described him as funny, loyal, full of energy, and always looking for the next big moment. There was no villain to prosecute. The beach had been closed, the warnings were obvious, and the shark had acted as nature intended. What made it harder to accept was how avoidable it all was. Liam didn't die because of bad luck, he died because he made a reckless choice, ignoring every posted sign and every recent report for the sake of a stunt. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a chain of impulsive decisions that ended exactly the way experts warn they can. And now, his story is told as a reminder of what happens when thrill wins out over sense. June 2nd, 2015 was already hot by mid-morning in the rural outskirts of Ocala, Florida. The cicadas had started early, buzzing through the palmettos, and the air inside the single-story home on Lake Eaton Road was thick with humidity and the faint, sour scent of reptile musk. Windows were shut tight, blankets had been tacked over them to block sunlight. Inside, the rooms were dim and cramped, lined wall to wall with stacked terrariums, mismatched heat lamps, and makeshift shelving covered in feeding charts, molted skins, and empty syringes. The man who lived there was 61-year-old Carl Dempsey, and he hadn't let an inspector through that door in over a decade. But that morning, something would finally get out, and help would come too late. Carl had once worked in landscaping, but after an injury in his late 40s, he withdrew from most public life. He sold his equipment, stopped answering phone calls from extended family, and poured everything into his true passion: snakes. Reticulated pythons, gaboon vipers, timber rattlesnakes, corn snakes. He didn't just keep them, he bred them, traded them, studied them obsessively. Most were acquired through back channels, online forums, private dealers, message boards, where exotic reptile owners swapped advice, photos, and the occasional illegal specimen. Florida's laws had changed in 2010, tightening restrictions on venomous snakes and requiring permits for certain species. Carl had ignored them. He stopped renewing licenses, refused to register new additions, and ranted online about government overreach. In the tight-knit world of underground herpetology, he was known as a purist, someone who believed in personal responsibility over regulation. He didn't see it as dangerous, he saw it as freedom. On that Tuesday, one of Carl's few in-person friends, 44-year-old Dave Holbrook, arrived for a visit. The two had met years earlier on a reptile enthusiast message board and bonded over a shared love of rare species. Dave didn't keep venomous snakes himself, but he admired Carl's collection, and Carl loved showing it off. That morning, after coffee and a half-hearted discussion about caging upgrades, Carl led Dave into the back room where the real show began. He opened the lid of a glass enclosure and reached inside. Coiled beneath a fake log was a West African bush viper, small, iridescent, and deceptively calm. Its emerald green scales shimmered under the red heat lamp, and for a moment the snake didn't move. Carl extended his hand confidently, intending to guide it out with a hook, but opted instead for his usual bare hand method. As his fingers hovered over the coils, the viper lashed out. It struck faster than either man could register. The motion was so fast, so fluid, that it was almost over before it began. Just a flash of movement and the sharp pop of fangs breaking skin. The snake latched onto the knuckle of Carl's left index finger and held it for nearly 2 seconds, jaws clamped tight, before retreating back into the shadows of the enclosure. Carl recoiled instantly, swearing, blood running down the side of his hand. The bite marks were clean but deep, 2 dark punctures already beginning to swell. He squeezed the wound, cursing again, and tried to laugh it off, waving away Dave's concern. But Dave had seen the strike. He knew enough about venomous snakes to recognize what they were dealing with, and it wasn't a dry bite. Within minutes, Carl's hand began to change. The skin around the bite turned red, then purple, then nearly black. His fingers stiffened, curling involuntarily, and the veins in his wrist bulged beneath the surface. Dave hovered anxiously, urging him to call for help, but Carl refused. shaking his head and stumbling to the kitchen to grab his makeshift first aid supplies. His attempt to treat the bite was crude. He rinsed the wound under cold water, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it in gauze that quickly soaked through with blood. He had no antivenom, few private keepers did, and even fewer had the legal ability to store or administer it. Instead, he downed 2 Benadryl tablets and poured himself half a glass of whiskey, muttering that it would all blow over. But it didn't. By the 40-minute mark, the swelling had spread past his elbow. His breathing grew shallow and sweat beaded on his forehead as his body temperature began to drop. He vomited twice, collapsing onto the floor and groaning in pain. His vision blurred, and when he tried to sit up, he collapsed again, this time harder. His hand, now 3 times its normal size, had turned nearly blue. Dave begged him to let him call 911, but Carl grew angry, panicked in a way Dave hadn't seen before. He muttered about the state taking his snakes, about raids and citations, about everything he'd built being destroyed. He said it wasn't worth it. He said he just needed to rest. And then he passed out. Right there on the linoleum floor, his arm grotesquely swollen and leaking blood through the gauze. His lips had turned pale, his breathing was ragged, shallow, and spaced unevenly. At 3:40 p.m., after watching Carl seize violently and lose consciousness again, Dave finally picked up the phone and made the call, ignoring his friend's warnings and deciding that saving his life mattered more than protecting his illegal hobby. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later, forced to enter through the back door when no one answered. They found Carl on the living room floor, unresponsive, his arm mottled and swollen nearly to the shoulder. He was barely breathing. They attempted resuscitation on site and administered epinephrine and fluids. But by the time the ambulance reached the hospital, Carl had gone into full cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at 4:32 p.m. Inside the home, first responders found over 70 snakes, several venomous, most improperly housed, and none legally documented. Animal control officers were called in to begin the process of identifying and removing the reptiles. Some were euthanized on the spot, others were transferred to wildlife sanctuaries and research centers. The entire house was deemed a biohazard. Carl's collection, his obsession, was dismantled within 48 hours. There was no funeral, no obituary. Dave provided a statement to authorities and quietly deleted his forum accounts a few weeks later. Online, in the darker corners of the reptile community, a few posts appeared mourning Carl's death. Others called him a martyr, someone who had died for the freedom to keep what he loved. But outside that world, the story was simple. A man ignored the law. He kept dangerous animals in secret, and when one of them bit him, he refused the help that could have saved his life. Not because there wasn't time, not because help didn't come, but because he didn't want anyone to know. It was January 22, 2017 in Ningbo, China, where the humid air of winter brushed the streets of Yingzhou District. The Ningbo Wildlife Park, a small but well-known zoo nestled on the outskirts of the city, prepared for another day of visitors. As families arrived in droves, the low murmur of chatter filled the air, mixing with the sounds of children laughing and playing near the zoo's playground. The towering walls of the park loomed around its borders, keeping the public at a distance from the animals within. The zoo was home to over 200 species, some native to China, others imported from distant lands. For most visitors, it offered an opportunity to see wildlife up close, though the conditions left much to be desired. The animals, many confined to small, overcrowded enclosures, were often taunted into performing tricks for the audience's entertainment. The filthy conditions and malnourishment of some animals were barely acknowledged by the visitors, and the harsh reality of life in captivity went unnoticed. But to those who spent enough time there, the zoo's grim atmosphere suggested that an accident might be inevitable. Mr. Zhang and his family had planned a simple Sunday afternoon out, accompanied by their friends, the Li family. As they approached the gates, both Mr. Zhang and Mr. Li felt that the 130 yuan entry fee, roughly $18 USD, was far too steep for what the zoo had to offer, so they decided to find another way in. Mr. Zhang's wife, unaware of their scheme, continued toward the main entrance with Mrs. Li and their children, oblivious to the plan that was about to unfold. The walls surrounding the zoo were high, at least 10 feet tall, but a tree near a section of the border caught Mr. Zhang's eye. It was close enough for him and Mr. Li to scale. The men, seeking a cheap thrill and the satisfaction of getting something for nothing, decided to bypass the ticket booth. They grabbed the low-lying branches, hoisted themselves up, and climbed the rest of the way to the top of the perimeter wall. On the other side of the wall, the ground was just a short drop away. Mr. Zhang, eager to see the zoo without paying, crouched down and let himself dangle from the edge. After a moment's hesitation, he let go, landing with a dull thud on the hard ground below. Mr. Li followed suit, both men celebrating their small victory. But a new challenge lay before them. Another wall, this time with sharp metal bars curving toward them like claws, stood in their path. Despite the clear warning signs posted on the wall, Mr. Zhang and Mr. Li pushed forward. Ignoring the signs and the risks involved, they searched for a way over. Mr. Li, with one foot on the other's shoulder, helped Mr. Zhang climb higher, their fingers gripping the bars. The climb wasn't easy, but it was manageable. When they finally reached the top of the second wall, they gazed down. Below them, 3 tigers lay in wait. Unbeknownst to the 2 men, they had climbed into the territory of Ningbo Zoo's most dangerous residents. Mr. Li, his heart pounding in his chest, quickly reconsidered. This was too risky. What had started as a bit of fun had quickly turned into a dangerous predicament. He began to climb down, deciding to retreat. But Mr. Zhang, now committed to the adventure, decided he wouldn't turn back. He was already there, and he wasn't about to leave without exploring the zoo further. Without a second thought, Mr. Zhang dropped down into the tiger enclosure. The tigers, alert to the intruder, stirred from their resting places. Their powerful bodies moved with precision as they slowly approached the new arrival. Mr. Zhang, having underestimated the animal's instinctive response, assumed they would be docile, as he had seen tigers in zoos before, usually disinterested or unbothered by the presence of visitors. But these were not docile creatures. These were wild animals, conditioned by captivity but still very much governed by their instincts. The moment Mr. Zhang's feet hit the ground, the tigers began their calculated approach, eyes fixed on the strange, vulnerable figure below. Visitors who had entered the zoo through the front gates saw what was unfolding in real time. Panicked voices rang out as children screamed and parents frantically tried to pull their families away from the viewing area. Within moments, one of the tigers lunged. It was sudden. The impact was violent. The tiger grabbed Mr. Zhang by the head, sinking its teeth deep into his skull. His scream was swallowed by the animal's powerful jaws. Mr. Zhang tried desperately to fight back, kicking and thrashing, but his body was weak compared to the raw strength of the tiger. His attempts grew more feeble as the tiger's grip tightened. On the wall above, Mr. Li stood frozen, his heart in his throat. He watched helplessly as his friend was mauled before his eyes. The situation was too dangerous for him to intervene. His mind raced, but no solution came. The tiger, with brutal force, tore at Mr. Zhang's body. Its fangs ripped through his jacket, exposing his flesh beneath. The other 2 tigers circled, keeping a watchful eye on the struggle, their hunger evident. The scene played out in front of horrified onlookers who had no way of stopping the carnage. For over an hour, the tiger toyed with its victim. It dragged Mr. Zhang across the grass, biting into different parts of his body before flipping him onto his back. Visitors watched in shock as Mr. Zhang's life slowly drained away. The tiger never let go. It was a predatory dance, a calculated show of power. The zoo staff had been alerted and armed police soon arrived on the scene. At first, firecrackers were detonated, but the noise had little effect on the tiger. Desperate, zookeepers aimed a powerful hose at the animal, but it barely flinched. The tiger continued to drag Mr. Zhang's body, oblivious to the distractions. The situation escalated quickly. With the tiger still locked onto Mr. Zhang's lifeless body, armed police took action. Under the direction of zoo staff, they fired on the animal, bringing it down. The tiger, once a symbol of raw, untamed power, lay still. The other two tigers were secured and confined to their indoor pens, but the damage had been done. Mr. Zhang, though unconscious, was still alive when emergency responders rushed into the enclosure to retrieve him. He was quickly transported to the hospital, but the wounds were too severe. Hours later, he was pronounced dead. What began as a simple family outing had turned into a devastating tragedy. A wife had lost her husband, children their father, and a tiger had lost its life as a consequence of human recklessness. In the aftermath, the zoo faced heavy scrutiny. Mr. Zhang's family, mourning the loss of their loved one, called for the zoo to take full responsibility. They demanded improvements in security measures, including more surveillance cameras and stricter access controls. They argued that had the zoo's perimeter been more secure, their loved one might still be alive. June 15, 2013 was the kind of Florida evening that felt like it could last forever. On a stretch of beach near Marathon in the Florida Keys, college students gathered around a fire pit, the air thick with salt, smoke, and cheap beer. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker half buried in the sand. Laughter came easy. The stars were bright, it was a summer break. And for Amber Keplar, 21, this was exactly the kind of night she lived for. But some waters, no matter how calm they seem, are never safe to step into, especially when the sun goes down. Amber had driven down from Tallahassee with 3 friends to celebrate the end of finals. She was loud in the best way, with sun-bleached hair, chipped nail polish, and a tendency to burst into song when no one expected it. A journalism major with a part-time waitressing job, she wasn't the type to play it safe. She was the type who jumped in without checking the water. Just before midnight, with most of the group winding down or passed out in camp chairs, Amber and her closest friend Lizzie, still buzzed from drinks and glowing with that carefree recklessness unique to 20-somethings on vacation, decided to skinny dip. It wasn't a dare, it wasn't planned. They just looked at each other, grinned, and ran for the surf, peeling off clothes and tossing them behind as they laughed their way down the sand. Locals had long avoided that particular inlet after dark, not because of tides or currents, but because the nearby dockside fish cleaning stations leaked into the shallows, drawing predators close. But sharks especially were known to patrol the warm coastal waters at night, hunting in silence just beyond the moonlit foam. Bull sharks are among the few large shark species that actively hunt in shallow coastal waters, and at night they become even more dangerous. With poor light to navigate by, they rely on vibration and movement, zeroing in on splashes that mimic struggling fish or injured prey. Unlike great whites that stalk from the deep, bull sharks patrol close to shore, sometimes in less than 3 feet of water. They're territorial, quick to react, and bold enough to strike without hesitation. For swimmers unaware or careless, the line between safe and fatal can disappear in seconds. The 2 girls waded in waist deep, their laughter echoing into the dark. Amber splashed ahead, arms raised, spinning as she fell backward into the water. Her friend stayed closer to shore, shivering from the sudden chill and hesitating from the sudden quiet. Then Amber screamed. It wasn't drawn out, it was sharp, immediate, and followed by thrashing so violent it sent water spraying in all directions. Lizzie turned in time to see Amber's leg disappear beneath the surface. Then her entire body dragged several feet into the deeper channel. She surfaced once, eyes wide, gasping, but the water around her was already tinted with blood. Lizzie swam back to shore in a panic, screaming for help. A few others ran toward the surf, confused, still half drunk. One tried to wade in, but the water was clouded and opaque, the tide pushing against him with eerie calm. Someone called 911 from a cell phone held aloft with shaking hands. Amber washed up 12 minutes later, pulled in by the tide. She was barely conscious, her leg torn open from thigh to knee, her body in shock. Paramedics arrived less than 10 minutes after that, but by then she had lost too much blood. CPR was attempted on the sand, lights flashing against pale faces and glass bottles, but her pulse never returned. She was declared dead at the scene. Officials identified the bite pattern as consistent with a bull shark, likely an adult male, drawn to the noise and motion in a shallow feeding zone. No search for the shark was initiated. The beach was temporarily closed and additional warning signs were installed along the access path. Local anglers had reported frequent shark presence for weeks prior, but without a specific threat, no formal action had been taken. Amber's friends packed up the next morning and drove home in silence. Her family held a small memorial at a marina near their home in Clearwater, where she'd grown up learning to swim, dive, and push boundaries just enough to keep life interesting. She was remembered for her laugh, her boldness, and her habit of diving in without always checking how deep the water was. The beach reopened, the fire pit was cleaned. The tide rolled on like nothing had happened. But for the people who were there that night, it wasn't the shark they remembered, it was the decision, one that never should have been made. March 11, 2018 dawned bright and dry in the low veld outside Hoedspruit, South Africa. By mid-morning, the rising sun cast sharp golden light over the bush, painting long shadows across the thorn trees and rust-colored soil. The cicadas were already humming, and the dry grass along the roadside swayed faintly in the warm breeze. Hoedspruit was known for its proximity to the famed Kruger National Park, but a different kind of attraction sat just a few kilometers from the main road, a sprawling private estate hidden behind steel fencing and dense vegetation. It was part villa, part party compound, and part illegal zoo, where exotic predators were kept not for conservation but for entertainment. Guests arrived expecting luxury, exclusivity, and the kind of photos you can't get anywhere else. What none of them realized was that one of those photos would come at a cost. The estate belonged to a wealthy investor who kept to himself, except when hosting weekends like this one. Behind the main house stood a network of enclosures: giraffes, cheetahs, white lions, Bengal tigers. There were no public tours, no licenses on record, and no professionals managing the animals. Just a few handlers who had been around long enough to know how to keep things quiet, and enough money floating around to make problems disappear. That weekend, the house was full of visitors, social media personalities, minor celebrities, and well-connected children of wealthy businessmen. Among them was 26-year-old Brandon Meyer, a Johannesburg native whose life revolved around image. Brandon wasn't an influencer in the traditional sense, but his curated Instagram feed showed off a life of luxury. Shirtless yacht trips, luxury cars, rooftop lounges, gym selfies, and overpriced sneakers photographed against polished marble floors. He had never worked on a conventional job and had never needed to. His father ran a regional airline and had made sure Brandon had everything he wanted, from designer clothes to a fully paid apartment in Sandton. For Brandon, life wasn't about stability, it was about attention, about getting the shot. And that morning, surrounded by cameras, drinks, and carefully staged jungle aesthetics, Brandon had one goal in mind: to take the kind of photo that would grab attention. Something dangerous, something impressive, something stupid. The lion enclosure was the crown jewel of the estate, a sun-bleached pen set behind reinforced metal fencing housing 2 adult lions. The male, Nyoka, was enormous, nearly 430 pounds with a thick mane and a frame built like a machine. He had been raised in captivity, bottle-fed as a cub, and paraded in front of guests for years. But lions, even those born in cages, do not become domesticated. They are apex predators, hardwired for dominance and precision, capable of bringing down prey far larger than a human. A lion's bite force can exceed 650 pounds per square inch. Their reflexes are lightning fast, and their instincts are not dulled by fences or familiarity. In the wild, lions can stalk and kill silently without hesitation. In captivity, the danger is compounded because people forget. They confuse tolerance with trust, and they get close, too close. Guests at the estate were told that Nyoka was safe to approach as long as they remained calm and didn't touch him. But no one mentioned the warning signs, the sudden lunges, the growls, the hours of restless pacing. Over the past year, Nyoka had shown increasing agitation, but the guests weren't told that. There were no visible safety protocols, no tranquilizer on standby, just an unspoken rule: smile for the camera and hope nothing goes wrong. By late morning, Brandon decided it was time. He wanted a photo kneeling beside the lion, one arm stretched behind him as though resting casually on Nyoka's back. Not for a project, not for a memory, for the likes. He handed his phone to another guest and stepped into the enclosure without hesitation. His white sneakers crunched over the packed dirt as he walked, sunglasses glinting in the sun, his sleeveless hoodie already darkening with sweat. The lion was resting beneath a tree, half shaded from the sun, his eyes low and unreadable. His tail twitched once, then again, slow, deliberate movements. A handler followed behind Brandon but kept his distance. No warnings were given, no one told Brandon to stop. He was already too close. Brandon crouched beside the lion with practiced ease, turning his head just enough to catch the angle of the camera. He grinned, not a wide smile, but the kind of confident smirk he'd used in countless photos before. With slow, deliberate movements, he stretched his arm behind him, adjusting his posture to make it appear as though his hand was resting lightly on Nyoka's back. In reality, he wasn't touching the lion at all. It was all for effect, a carefully staged moment meant to look effortless, like he belonged there, like he was in control. But Nyoka was already watching. The lion rose without a sound. No warning growl, no shifting stance, just a sudden fluid movement, like a switch had been flipped. One moment he was crouched in the shade, the next he was up, muscles coiled, gaze locked on Brandon. In a single stride, Nyoka closed the distance. His jaws opened wide, and with terrifying speed, they snapped shut around Brandon's left shoulder. The sound was sickening. Bone and flesh crushed in an instant as Brandon screamed and toppled sideways, his body crumpling under the weight of the impact. But Nyoka didn't stop. He pushed forward, dragging Brandon down completely, teeth sinking deeper into muscle. Blood began to soak the ground beneath them, pooling into the dust as Brandon kicked wildly, trying to free himself. Around them, panic erupted. Guests backed away in horror, some screamed, others bolted for the enclosure gate. One man stood frozen, still holding Brandon's phone, the camera app open but forgotten. Brandon flailed, trying to crawl, but the lion was already adjusting his grip. Nyoka's jaw shifted to the side of Brandon's neck and clamped down again, this time pulling him backward with frightening ease. Brandon's screams grew wet and strained as blood filled his mouth, his hands scraping helplessly at the ground. Nyoka repositioned once more, rearing slightly before slamming his weight down and locking his jaws onto the back of Brandon's skull. The force of the bite fractured his cervical spine and tore through the soft tissue of his scalp. Then came the shaking, violent, decisive. The movement left deep gashes across Brandon's head and neck, the lion's mane whipping with each brutal twist. It took nearly a minute before anyone reacted with purpose. One staff member ran to retrieve a fire extinguisher from a nearby equipment shed. Another grabbed a long steel rod and began jabbing desperately at the lion's side. When the extinguisher was finally discharged, a cloud of white foam engulfed the lion's head, momentarily disorienting him. Neoka hesitated, snarled, and then finally released his grip and backed away slowly. Blood streaked across his muzzle. Brandon's body was limp when they dragged him out. His sleeveless hoodie was shredded. Deep lacerations carved across his ribs and shoulders. One eye was swollen shut from blunt trauma. His breathing was erratic, short, shallow gasps that signaled how little time he had left. There was blood everywhere, smeared across the dirt and smeared across the hands of the people who had watched it all happen. No one said anything. There was nothing left to say. Paramedics were called and he was still alive when loaded into the ambulance. He regained consciousness for a few seconds, then slipped under again. His blood pressure collapsed en route to the hospital. Emergency responders attempted to stabilize him, but he went into cardiac arrest less than 10 minutes into the drive. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The official cause of death was listed as major blood loss resulting from extensive trauma to the neck and upper torso, including a partially severed spine. In the days that followed, the estate was shut down by provincial authorities, though no formal charges were filed. Neoka was tranquilized and relocated to a secure wildlife facility several hours north. Most of the guests who witnessed the attack gave brief statements to investigators and quietly left the estate within 48 hours. A few removed their posts from that weekend, but others left them up, cropped and captioned without mention of what had happened. None of them spoke to the media. Whatever guilt or shock they carried, they kept it private. There are many ways to die. Some are tragic, some are unlucky, and some, like this, are simply dumb. July 16, 2016 was heavy and hot off the coast of Key West, Florida. The air sat thick over the ocean, turning the sea surface into a glassy mirror that reflected the moonlight in long, broken strips. A private catamaran floated quietly just beyond the reef line, anchored in a feeding channel known to local captains as a place to avoid after dark. Here, in the deeper cuts between sandbars and limestone shelves, the tides pushed bait fish through narrow passages, bringing larger predators with them. Beneath the calm surface, the current churned with activity, and above, on the deck of a rented party boat, no one was thinking about what swam below. Tyler Grimshaw was 27 and restless, the kind of person who always needed movement. He worked odd jobs around Tampa: construction, seasonal landscaping, sometimes delivery driving, but rarely stayed in one role for long. He liked people, attention, and adventure, especially the kind that involved pushing limits. His friends called him fearless. Others might have called him impulsive. He was athletic, outgoing, and known for taking risks that made everyone nervous but usually ended in laughter. He didn't have a death wish, he just didn't believe anything bad would happen. The boat had been rented to celebrate a friend's birthday with nearly 20 guests on board. As night fell, music played from a small speaker, red plastic cups lined the railing, and the catamaran glowed under deck lights that cut sharp edges across the water. It was meant to be a night of drinking and dancing beneath the stars. Most of the guests stayed close to the center of the boat, barefoot and relaxed, enjoying the breeze and the open air. Tyler, however, wasn't the type to stay on the sidelines. He'd been drinking heavily for hours, bouncing between groups, louder and more animated with each passing hour. The waters around Key West are rich with marine life, but certain deep channels beyond the reef are known danger zones, transition points between shallow flats and deeper hunting grounds where predators thrive. Few are more suited to these murky, brackish waters than the bull shark, large, territorial, and highly aggressive. Unlike great whites or tiger sharks, bull sharks can tolerate fresh water and hunt with precision in low visibility. Measuring up to 11 feet and weighing over 500 pounds, they strike with over 1,300 pounds of bite force. Fast, relentless, and easily triggered by the splash and thrash of a human in the dark. Just before 10 p.m., Tyler climbed up onto the guardrail, arms wide, and dove headfirst into the dark. The music kept playing. A few people laughed, others panicked. The water swallowed him in an instant, and for a few moments he was visible, treading water, backstroking, calling out as he swam just beyond the reach of the deck lights. People shouted for him to come back. Some moved toward the edge of the boat, trying to spot him in the dark. But Tyler kept swimming deeper into the shadows. Then something changed. A sharp splash echoed from the far side of the boat, followed by a single sharp cry. It was short, abrupt, and loud enough to make the music seem suddenly distant. When the spotlight swept the water, Tyler was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no flailing limbs, no second scream. Just a swirl in the water and a torn piece of fabric that floated up seconds later. One of Tyler's friends, sober enough to act, grabbed a phone and called the Coast Guard. On deck, the captain pulled the boat away from the spreading blood as guests shouted Tyler's name into the dark, scanning the waves with flashlights. No one jumped in. The water was too black, too still. For nearly 20 minutes they searched, circling the deck, tossing life rings, sweeping the surface with spotlights. But Tyler was gone. Rescue boats launched from shore with helicopters overhead within the hour. Divers entered before dawn using floodlights and sonar to comb the seabed. The crew gave detailed statements about the timing and location, but by the next afternoon, only a sneaker and a torn strip of shirt had been found. Blood in the water confirmed what officials already suspected. Tyler had likely been taken by a bull shark, drawn to the sound and thrashing in a known feeding corridor. His body was never recovered. The shark was never identified or pursued. Tyler's death stunned his family and friends. A memorial was held in Tampa that weekend, with a collage of photos displayed near a folded t-shirt and an untouched drink from the party that never ended. The service was quiet. Some were angry, most were just bewildered. Tyler had always seemed invincible until he wasn't. The reality was hard to ignore. He made a reckless choice, diving into predator-filled waters at night while drunk, ignoring every warning from the people around him. It was April 20th, 2007 in Beihai City, located in South China's Guangxi Autonomous Region. The famous holiday resort Yintan, also known as Silver Beach, was a place of allure, drawing visitors from all corners of the country. This resort, with its gleaming sands and serene waters, was typically a retreat for families seeking leisure. The beach, known as the finest in China, stretched for miles under the golden sun, its quartz sand shimmering like silver beneath the sunlight. Tourists engaged in water sports, swimming and picnicking along the coast, all the while oblivious to the more perilous side of the resort. At the edge of the beach stood the holiday resort, which housed a variety of entertainment, including a notorious crocodile show. The crocodiles were kept in a small, inconspicuous enclosure where they performed for visitors. The spectacle included throwing dead meat into the water or holding it high for the crocodiles to leap, sometimes as high as 5 feet into the air. Visitors marveled at the reptiles' power and agility. But the enclosure wasn't just a place for entertainment. To the children of the nearby primary schools, the crocodile enclosure had become a place of daredevil challenges. Every few days, groups of boys would sneak into the area after school hours, climbing over the low wall surrounding the pool and daring each other to get as close as possible to the crocodiles. Armed with sticks and rocks, they would rush into the enclosure and smack the crocodiles on their heads before fleeing back to safety. It was a cruel game, one that seemed harmless to the children, but one which held terrible consequences for those who were brave enough to participate. That evening at around 6 p.m., a group of 4 9-year-old boys from CNN Primary School, Lu Heyang among them, decided to take part in the infamous Crocodile Challenge. With wooden sticks, slingshots, and a handful of pebbles, the group walked to the resort. The resort was closed for the day and the grounds were eerily quiet. The gates weren't locked, offering an easy entry for the children, who moved swiftly, staying as quiet as possible. The wall surrounding the crocodile pool stood at only a meter in height in some places, and in others it was as low as 55 centimeters or 22 inches tall. It was not designed to keep people out, and it was certainly no match for a determined group of children. There had even been an incident a few years prior when several of the crocodiles managed to escape through a drainage pipe that led to the beach. A panic ensued when sunbathers and swimmers were suddenly confronted by the reptiles, but fortunately no one was harmed before the crocodiles were recaptured. As Liu and his friends climbed the low wall and dropped into the enclosure, they ignored the large warning signs that were clearly displayed, urging visitors to stay away from the crocodiles. But the thrill of the challenge outweighed any caution for the boys. They dropped into the pool area, and the crocodiles, many of them basking on the sides of the pool, looked up curiously at the newcomers. The children quickly began loading their slingshots with rocks, shooting them at the reptiles. The rocks struck with a thud, and some of the crocodiles hissed and slid into the water to escape. The true test of bravery came next. One of the boys, in an act of defiance, ran up to a crocodile and with a stick in hand, slammed it down on the creature's head before sprinting away with excitement. The other boys watched eagerly, waiting for their turn. When it was Liu's turn, he took up the stick and walked toward the same crocodile. The animal, having already been provoked, was on edge. As Liu swung the stick down on its head, the crocodile in an instant lunged forward. Its jaws snapped with terrifying precision, and in a flash, Liu was dragged into the water by his shirt. His terrified screams echoed through the empty resort, but they were drowned out by the roar of the water. The other boys rushed to the pool's edge, one of them reaching out to grab Liu's hand, but it was too late. Liu was pulled under the water as the crocodile readjusted its grip and tightened its deadly jaws on his torso. The boys could see Liu's eyes bulging in fear as he momentarily surfaced. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was evident in his eyes, but there was nothing they could do. The other 10 crocodiles, sensing the commotion and the smell of fresh blood, slid into the water and began to feast on the helpless boy. Liu's friends could only watch in helpless horror as their friend was torn apart by the beasts. A dark cloud of blood swirled in the murky water. The once quiet pool now a scene of carnage. The children, their hearts racing with fear, scrambled to escape. They leapt over the wall, racing for help. Their desperate cries were heard by Liu Zhan, the crocodile keeper. Hired by the park after the previous escape incident, Liu Zhan had the responsibility of managing the crocodiles. However, that evening the pool had been closed for the day, and the keeper was inside cooking a meal. He hadn't noticed the children sneaking into the enclosure. Upon hearing the children's screams, Liu Zhan rushed to the crocodile pool. What he saw was beyond anything he could have imagined. The water was turbulent and the crocodiles were still in the midst of their feeding frenzy. Liu's body was partially submerged in the water, his lifeless form being tugged in different directions by the monstrous reptiles. The sight was harrowing. When the police arrived, they quickly called in special armed units. A group of snipers was dispatched to deal with the crocodiles. Armed with raw pork, the snipers lured the crocodiles out of the water, where they were distracted by the food. As the crocodiles emerged, the snipers took aim at the one believed to have killed Liu. 7 bullets struck the enormous creature, a 2.6 meter, 8.5 foot long, 330-pound predator. The crocodile was dragged out of the pool and transported to a trailer for dissection. Inside its stomach, they found the remains of Liu's body. Though the other crocodiles had participated in the attack, it was this particular reptile that had caused most of the damage. Following the attack, the pool was drained and the remaining crocodiles were removed. The animals were relocated to the Zhangji Endangered Wild Animal Protection Center in Nanning, a facility that had the proper permits and infrastructure to house such dangerous creatures. The 3 children who had witnessed the brutal attack were left in a state of shock. They were unable to fully comprehend what had occurred, their minds struggling to process the horror. They were incoherent when questioned by the police, their eyes filled with terror. At night, they woke screaming from nightmares, their minds trapped in the trauma of the event. A doctor from Bai People's Hospital, Liu Wei, confirmed that the children were receiving psychological treatment, and he urged the school staff to avoid discussing the incident in front of them while they tried to cope with the aftermath. In the courts, the responsibility for Liu's death fell on the park and the crocodile keeper. It was determined that the crocodile enclosure had not been properly secured and that the park had operated without the necessary licenses to keep the animals. The courts awarded Liu's family compensation 220,000 yuan, the equivalent of about $3,600, but no amount of money could bring back their son. What began as a dare, an innocent challenge that had been carried out countless times before by local children, had ended in tragedy. The game, once a source of excitement and thrill, had turned into a nightmare for all involved. And for Liu Haiyang, the crocodile challenge had been his ultimate test. July 19, 2022 began in silence on the banks of the Brooks River, deep within Katmai National Park, Alaska. Mist clung low to the ground, creeping between the trees and drifting over the cold, fast-moving water. In the soft light of early morning, the landscape felt untouched and ancient. Wooden boardwalks stretched above the brush and marsh, weaving through the forest like narrow bridges between worlds. The air was damp, the stillness broken only by the distant rush of waterfalls and the occasional call of a gull. It was a setting designed for awe and for caution. The bears were already awake. Tyler Brooks had always chased the shot. At 30 years old, he had built a modest following online through bold photography, sweeping drone footage, precarious cliffside poses, and landscape shots taken just beyond the limits of safety tape. His captions read like mini adventure logs, and his followers knew him as a mix of explorer and thrill seeker. He wasn't reckless in the obvious ways, but he walked a fine line between bold and dumb. He liked being the guy who went just a little farther than the signs allowed. That mentality had earned him some stunning photos and more than a few close calls. When he booked a trip to Katmai National Park with his girlfriend, it was the bears that drew him in. This wasn't just another nature destination, it was one of the only places on Earth where you could safely view wild grizzlies at close range, thanks to the park's raised boardwalks and strict no-contact rules. It was raw, real, and visually spectacular, perfect for the kind of story he liked to tell. His girlfriend Maya Reyes had different goals. At 27, she was quieter, more measured, with a background in conservation biology and a deep respect for wildlife. She had dreamed of visiting Katmai since college, and she'd come prepared, reading every rule, packing bear spray, following guidelines to the letter. For her, the trip was about connection and observation, not content. She admired Tyler's passion, but she didn't always share his instincts. In wild places, she believed curiosity had limits for a reason. The difference between them didn't seem like a problem at first, but in Katmai, it only took one moment for it to matter. They had arrived at Brooks Camp the previous afternoon, taken the safety briefing, and walked the boardwalk trail to the viewing platform over the river. The bears were everywhere, lumbering between trees, standing belly deep in the water, swiping salmon from the current. At night, they stayed in a small lodge just beyond the main trail network. Rangers had warned them that bears could appear anywhere at any time, and that stepping off the designated paths was strictly forbidden. Maya took that seriously. Tyler, less so. The next morning, just after sunrise, they set out early to photograph the mist rising off the river. The boardwalk was empty at that hour, the world still cloaked in fog. It was the kind of atmosphere Tyler loved. Moody, cinematic, unpredictable. As they reached a bend in the trail near a small clearing, he noticed a cluster of trees where the light was breaking through just enough to cast a soft golden hue on the water. The angle was nearly perfect, but part of the scene was obscured by brush. From where they stood, the composition wasn't quite right. Tyler stepped toward the railing and peered through his lens. Maya stood nearby, already uneasy. There were posted warning signs every few yards. Do not leave the boardwalk. Bear activity is frequent and unpredictable. Violators may be fined or removed from the park. She reminded him quietly, but Tyler brushed her off. He said he'd just take one step into the grass to get a better shot and come right back. Before she could say more, he slipped under the railing and into the underbrush, camera in hand. He moved slowly, crouched low, eyes on the shot. His boots crunched softly over damp leaves as he pushed through ferns and low branches, focused entirely on the frame in front of him. The clearing opened slightly, revealing a mirror-still path of water surrounded by trees. It was beautiful, untouched, exactly the kind of moment he lived for. But what Tyler didn't realize was that he was not alone. Brown bears, also known as coastal grizzlies, are among the largest land predators in North America. In Katmai, they thrive in part because of the protected status of the park and the steady supply of salmon from nearby Brooks Falls. During peak season, dozens of bears congregate in the same region, sometimes within view of each other. Males can weigh over 1,200 pounds and reach 10 feet tall standing upright. They're built for power and endurance, capable of sprinting at 35 miles per hour and delivering a bite force strong enough to crush bones. Their senses of smell and hearing are extraordinary, and they are particularly dangerous when startled or defending territory. Despite this, bear attacks in Katmai are extremely rare. That's because the park's infrastructure, boardwalks, signage, ranger patrols, is built around minimizing surprise encounters. But the system only works when people follow the rules, and Tyler had just stepped out of bounds. As he adjusted his camera and lowered into a crouch, a sound cut through the quiet, sharp and immediate, a branch snapping, low and close. Tyler froze. Maya, watching from the boardwalk, held her breath, her body suddenly rigid. The fog muffled everything except the thudding in her chest. From behind a dense wall of alder brush to his left, a massive brown bear stepped into view. It had likely been resting just beyond sight, its presence masked by the thick vegetation and morning haze. Its fur was dark with dampness, its eyes fixed and alert, nostrils flaring as it processed Tyler's scent. For a long second, neither moved. Then the bear's ears flattened, its body tensed, and then it charged. The speed was unreal. Maya barely had time to scream his name. Tyler turned and tried to run, scrambling backward, but the brush slowed him. The bear barreled forward like a freight train, silent except for the sound of breaking branches. In seconds, it was on him. It struck him from behind with its full weight, knocking him flat into the dirt. The impact alone fractured his ribs. Before he could cry out, the bear's jaws clamped down on his upper back and shoulder, crunching through bone with horrifying ease. He screamed then, sharp, ragged, but it was brief. The bear shook him violently, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll before slamming him back down. Tyler tried to crawl, dragging himself forward by his elbows, but the bear raked its claws across his spine and thighs, shredding fabric and flesh in the same motion. One claw tore through his side, exposing muscle. Blood sprayed across the ferns. His legs kicked once, then spasmed. Maya's screams echoed across the boardwalk. She waved her arms, desperate to do something, anything, but knew that stepping into the brush would only lead to two bodies on the ground. She shouted again. The bear didn't flinch. It repositioned, gripping Tyler's torso with its front legs while biting into the side of his neck. The sound was wet, final. The bear then grabbed his head in its jaws and gave a single powerful shake. The motion snapped the upper vertebrae and crushed part of the skull. And then, as quickly as it had come, the bear released him. It stood over the body for a moment, huffing, its breath visible in the cold morning air. Then it turned and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing into the same brush it had come from, silent once again. Tyler's body lay crumpled in the undergrowth, motionless. His camera lay several feet away, cracked and stained, its lens shattered. Rangers arrived roughly 10 minutes later, alerted by another hiker who had heard Maya's screams from farther down the trail. Maya was in shock, unable to speak, her hands still trembling as they led her away. Emergency responders reached Tyler, but there was no chance of revival. He had suffered catastrophic injuries, multiple skull fractures, a crushed cervical spine, deep puncture wounds to the chest and back, and massive internal bleeding. The attack had lasted less than 60 seconds, but by the time help arrived, he was already gone. Authorities temporarily closed access to that section of the park and posted updated warnings, though no changes were made to the existing infrastructure. The bear was not located and no attempt was made to track it. In the eyes of the park, the bear had behaved naturally in a protected space. Tyler had not. Maya returned home alone. She declined interviews, requested Tyler's social accounts be memorialized, and released no public statement. The final photos on his memory card were recovered by park staff. The last image, blurred by movement, showed the edge of the clearing, lit by a shaft of early sun. There were no lawsuits, no public outcry, just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the dumbest choices are the ones that seem small in the moment. One step, one photo, one decision to ignore a rule meant to keep you alive. And in the wilderness, that's all it takes. March 14, 2015 was clear and windless along the rugged coastline of Duker Point, just south of Cape Town. The Atlantic shimmered with deceptive calm, lapping gently against the base of towering cliffs that had become a magnet for thrill seekers. The waves slapped rhythmically against the rocks, birds wheeled overhead, and on top of the cliff, a group of university students stood barefoot in the sun, daring each other toward the edge. They weren't tourists, they were locals. They knew the coast, knew the rumors, and knew that below them the water churned with currents colder and deeper than it looked. But that afternoon, they didn't care. The plan was simple: cliff diving. No wetsuits, no gear, just a quick plunge into the open ocean and a scramble back onto the rocks. Among them was 22-year-old Jordan Macefield, tall, athletic, and the kind of extrovert people naturally followed. Jordan had always leaned into risk. He was the one who suggested Duker Point in the first place. The area had a reputation known for its dramatic rock faces and deep entry points. It offered one of the few spots where you could jump from over 30 feet into the ocean without hitting reef or sand. But it also carried another much darker reputation. The nearby rocks were home to a seal colony, dozens of slick barking bodies that sunbathed on the shoreline and slipped like shadows into the water. And where there are seals in the Cape, there are great white sharks. The group knew this. Signs had been posted a year earlier after multiple shark sightings, warning against swimming or diving in the area. Local rangers had updated the advisory list just 2 days before, noting increased predatory activity in the shallows. But by the time Jordan and his friends arrived that morning, the surf was low, the cliffs were dry, and the temptation was stronger than the caution. One by one, the group began to jump. Jordan was last. He raised his arms, shouted something no one quite heard, and hurled himself off the ledge. He hit the water cleanly and surfaced a moment later, grinning and throwing his fist in the air. The others cheered from above. But then, without warning, something massive surged from below. There was no splash, no warning fin, just a violent jolt that pulled Jordan backward under the surface as if a rope had been yanked from the deep. A few seconds passed, then the water near the jump site turned red. great white sharks are deeply woven into the marine ecosystem of South Africa's Western Cape. Dierker Point, just south of Cape Town, lies along the edge of what's known as the Shark Alley Corridor, where cold Benguela currents meet rich breeding grounds for seals, tuna, and other prey. Here, great whites don't migrate through, they stay. Scientists have tracked the same individuals returning year after year, using coastal shelves and sea colonies as ambush points. Their hunting relies on stealth. They strike upward, fast and silent, using the contrast of sunlight on the surface to target silhouettes. In areas like this, where rocky outcrops host hundreds of seals, and human activity overlaps with feeding zones, a splash in the wrong place can look exactly like a kill trigger. Jordan had leapt into the center of their territory. At first, the group thought it was a prank. Jordan was known for stunts, and the sudden disappearance looked staged. But when he didn't resurface and when a second cloud of blood appeared, darker and wider than the first, the mood shifted. Screaming erupted. One of the students tried to climb down the cliff toward the shoreline while another ran for cell reception. A third called emergency services as the rest stared helplessly at the calm surface where their friend had vanished just seconds earlier. Rescue teams arrived within the hour. The National Sea Rescue Institute launched a search using boats, divers, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. They scanned the coastline for hours. No body was ever found. A single torn swim fin was recovered near the edge of the seal rocks, but beyond that, there was nothing. Officials confirmed that shark activity had been recorded in the area days earlier and reiterated that Dierker Point had never been a sanctioned diving location. A temporary restriction was issued, and signs were reposted with more prominent warnings. Jordan's University held a memorial later that week. Flowers, stories, and a worn photo of him mid-jump on a hiking trip, suspended in the air with his arms wide open. Friends remembered him as fearless, impulsive, and always chasing the next thrill. But even those closest to him admitted he pushed too far. He saw the warnings and jumped anyway. June 15, 2023 at the San Diego Zoo was like any other summer evening. The sprawling 100-acre facility had closed its gates at 8 p.m., leaving only essential staff to monitor the grounds. The lion enclosure, situated in the heart of the African Savannah exhibit, housed 6 magnificent African lions behind its 16-foot concrete walls and inward curving fencing. The pride's dominant male, Zulu, had been the zoo's star attraction since his arrival 5 years prior. African lions are apex predators known for their immense strength, speed, and lethal precision. In the wild, they hunt in coordinated packs, taking down prey much larger than themselves. Despite their majestic appearance, they're responsible for hundreds of human fatalities annually in certain regions of Africa. Even in captivity, their primal instincts remain intact, making any interaction with them inherently dangerous. The barriers at zoos are not merely for observation, they're a necessary divide between life and death. Marcus and his friends, however, failed to grasp this reality. As the zoo settled into silence, Zulu and his pride dozed atop their elevated rocks, their ears twitching at the occasional rustling from nocturnal animals nearby. But that night, unfamiliar voices and stumbling footsteps would stir something deeper, the primal instincts of an apex predator. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical troublemaker, he was a dreamer, a young man with an insatiable curiosity for the ocean and its mysteries. A junior at San Diego State University studying marine biology, he maintained a 3.8 GPA and worked part-time at the local aquarium, where he loved teaching children about marine ecosystems. His mother, a single parent, had sacrificed everything to put him through college, and Marcus carried the weight of her dreams alongside his own. Beyond academics, Marcus had a passion for adventure. He was the type to surf at sunrise, hike treacherous trails, and dive into freezing waters just for the thrill. His friends admired his fearless nature, but they also knew it sometimes led him into trouble. Professors described him as bright and promising, though sometimes prone to peer pressure, a fatal flaw that would cost him his life. On the night of June 15th, Marcus and his friends gathered outside, savoring the warm summer air with drinks in hand. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just another carefree night like many before. The group consisted of Marcus, Jake, Tyler, Chris, and David, close friends, all around the same age. Though Marcus was the youngest at 23, he never let that stop him from keeping up. At first, the night was lighthearted, just laughter, casual conversation, and the comforting familiarity of longtime friends. But as the alcohol flowed, so did their boldness. What started as harmless fun soon escalated into reckless dares, each challenge pushing them further past the limits of common sense. The group egged each other on, daring one another to attempt feats they'd never consider sober, sprinting across empty intersections, scaling rooftops, and balancing on ledges, each stunt riskier than the last. The thrill of danger coursed through them, drowning out any hesitation. The line between excitement and recklessness blurred, and none of them realized just how close they were to crossing it. Marcus, always eager to prove himself, embraced the chaos. To him, pushing limits wasn't just exciting, it was what made life worth living. Fueled by adrenaline and the need to impress, he took every challenge head-on, feeding off the group's wild energy. Security cameras captured them approaching the zoo's perimeter fence late that night, their phone lights bobbing erratically in the darkness. Marcus, his judgment clouded by countless shots of tequila, had thrown out the idea of sneaking into the lion enclosure to take wild photos. It was a ridiculous, idiotic suggestion, the kind that should have been dismissed outright. But in their drunken state, the absurdity of it only made it more appealing. It wasn't about logic anymore, it was about proving who had the guts to do something truly outrageous. It started as a reckless thought, but the mix of alcohol and peer encouragement quickly turned it into a dangerous reality. His friends would later recall trying to talk him out of it, but their own intoxication prevented them from being more forceful. A maintenance gate, improperly secured during an evening shift change, provided their entry point. While security responded to a routine motion sensor alert near the elephant enclosure, the intoxicated students made their way through the darkened pathways, their loud whispers echoing through the empty grounds. When they reached the lion exhibit, the pride lay sprawled across their elevated rocks, basking in the dim zoo lighting. Nearby, a maintenance golf cart had been carelessly left behind, an oversight, a clear violation of zoo protocol. But to Marcus, it was an opportunity. Despite some of his friends' protest, likely the ones still sober enough to recognize the insanity of it, he climbed onto the cart, using it to hoist himself up onto the enclosure wall. Jake, one of his friends, tried to stop him, calling the idea reckless and beyond stupid, but Marcus only laughed, waving him off. Chris, on the other hand, egged him on, shoving him playfully and calling him a coward if he didn't go through with it. Fueled by alcohol and the intoxicating thrill of the moment, Marcus felt unstoppable. The danger didn't register, only the adrenaline rush, the chance to do something outrageous, something that would make people talk for years. He wasn't thinking about consequences, he was thinking about glory. After a few minutes, Marcus lost his balance. The alcohol dulled his reflexes, clouding his judgment and making his footing unstable. As he teetered on the narrow ledge of the enclosure's outer barrier, his arms flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto. The world seemed to tilt, and before he could steady himself, his foot slipped. He stumbled forward, crashing over the edge and plummeting into the enclosure below. The impact drove the air from his lungs, his pained gasps echoing in the night air. He had landed in the worst possible place, face first into fresh lion dung, the acrid smell filling his nose, adding humiliation to what would soon become a fatal mistake. Above him, his friends stood frozen in shock. But Marcus wasn't alone for long. The lions had noticed. Zulu's reaction wasn't immediate. The lion rose slowly, his ears pricked forward, golden eyes unblinking. Then Marcus stumbled, cursing loudly and waving his arms in frustration. The attack was explosive and devastating. Zulu's massive paw crashed into Marcus's back, claws raking through fabric and skin. Before Marcus could process what was happening, the lion's powerful jaws clamped around his shoulder, crushing muscle and bone with terrifying ease. With lethal precision, Zulu adjusted his grip to Marcus's throat, severing arteries in an instant. Jake and Tyler fled in horror, while Chris stood frozen at the viewing area. David managed to call 911, his trembling voice barely coherent as he reported the emergency. Zoo security arrived within minutes armed with tranquilizer guns and high-powered rifles, but it was already too late. The rescue attempt was both desperate and futile. Security personnel fired multiple tranquilizer darts at Zulu, but the adrenaline-fueled lion remained focused on its prey. By the time the tranquilizers took effect, Marcus had been dead for several minutes. It took a team of 8 people to retrieve his body from the enclosure. The aftermath sent shockwaves through the community. News of the tragedy spread quickly, dominating local and national headlines. Public outrage erupted, with heated debates over whether the zoo had failed in its duty to secure the facility or if Marcus and his friends bore sole responsibility. Social media buzzed with conflicting opinions. Some called it a senseless tragedy, while others labeled it as an example of reckless thrill-seeking gone horribly wrong. The San Diego Zoo held a press conference where officials expressed deep regret over the incident while defending their safety protocols. However, scrutiny mounted as investigations uncovered security lapses. Animal rights organizations also weighed in, some arguing that captivity itself was to blame for such encounters, while others focused on the dangers of human interference. The psychological impact on Marcus's friends proved devastating. None of them could erase the image of Marcus's final moments, the primal brutality of the attack, and the sickening realization that there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fraternity faced a year-long suspension, though an investigation found no evidence that they had orchestrated the zoo break-in. Whether it's a selfie with a bear or poking a lion through the fence, these stories prove that nature doesn't tolerate stupidity. Wild animals aren't here for your entertainment, and they definitely don't care about your vacation plans. For more outrageous encounters and unbelievable moments, click on the next video.